Many game studios will use custom shaders created specifically for the game they're making, in addition to the standard and standard specular setup shader. Writing the code for a custom shader is outside the scope of this project, but if you'd like to look into it, here's how. Down in my asset, I'll right-click and choose Create and Shader. And under Shader, here's a standard surface shader, an unlit, an image effect, and a compute shader. A shader, then, is recognizable by the rainbow gradient and S icon. We can see we have different options available here, right now starting out with just the albedo, an RGB map. If we double-click on this, we'll open up that shader in MonoDevelop. MonoDevelop is opened, and this is the actual code behind that shader. What we're seeing here is that this is a new surface shader starting out. What this code defines then is how that shader is going to function, the different surfacing model, and what the fallback is. That is, if a particular platform can't display this shader accurately, what should it substitute in? We can go into great depth in shaders, but again, that's outside the scope of this course. If you'd like to explore it, take a look at the Unity documentation, as there's many great resources for creating your own shader. Once you've got a new shader made, you can simply drag it onto a material to apply it. Now my new material shows as a custom new surface shader, and there's the default albedo and its tiling, and also sliders for smoothness and metallic properties. Again, this is a custom shader. I haven't done anything to it, but this is a custom shader where I can really adjust the possibilities in it. Perhaps in a game we need to artificially tint the way a shader lights in a certain way, and a standard shader might be a good option. Again, depending on the look we're after, there's a range of possibilities in custom shaders beyond the standard shader. In this video, we'll look at creating and modifying some of the materials for our Zombie Toys game project. We've got some materials that imported in when we imported the FBXs of the different models. I'll go into our Models folder and into Environment, for example. There's our different models in here, and we can see in here a Materials folder. Again, Unity created this automatically for us. These materials have their maps in place and are ready for further adjustment. Alternately, we can create and assign new materials if we need. I'll pick Arch as new and take a look at it. What we're seeing here is that the maps are in the right place. There's our albedo, the general color of the material without lighting data, the normal map, adding detail, and we can click on any of these to select them here in the project window, and finally the occlusion. Where is that material showing more or less the indirect lighting? To really fine-tune this, I'm going to pull that model into my scene. I'll take my Arch's model and drag it in, pressing F to frame that selection and scrolling in just a little bit to zoom in the scene view. We can see that this is a collection of wooden blocks, a couple of arches, and a couple of straight pieces. What I'm going to do is to select that material and lock my inspector. Now I can deselect the arches so I don't see the wireframe on shaded here, and instead I can just adjust that material and see how they react in light. One of the things I like to do when I'm looking at a material is first adjust how it reacts to light before I really look at the color of the material. I'm going to change this material from a standard specular setup back to a standard shader. We can see the blocks get a bit duller, and now I'm going to adjust the smoothness a bit. These are painted wooden blocks, and I want them to have a little bit more shine, so I'll bring up that smoothness right around 0.5. On material values here, if it looks right, it's right. We don't have to be exact here, so 0.502 is just fine. I've got a nice shine across these, and spinning around shows me some glimmering highlights on those radiused edges. I'm going to add a little bit of a metallic property. Again, we can use metallic in here to concentrate the highlight, not necessarily saying that it's a metal, but it needs to have a little bit stronger specular highlight and a little bit more contribution from the reflection. I'll bring up that metallic right around 0.1, and we can see some glimmering edges on that model. If you'd like, you can use the tint here in the albedo to provide a bit of a unifying color. For example, clicking on this yellow color here pulls up my color picker, and right now I'm working in the hue, saturation, and value sliders. If you'd like, you can switch back and forth between HSV and red, green, and blue, RGB, by clicking on the icon in the middle right. Personally, I prefer to work in hue, saturation, and value. Adding some color into this tints those blocks, in this case turning them very red. What I'm going to do is just add a little bit more of a pale yellow wood tone to these. Remember, when you're adding color, a little goes a long way. A little bit of extra, we'll call it pale yellow, maybe a little bit warmer, just adds a touch of a unifying color across these. This material is ready, and it's already applied to that object. So if we make this object later into a prefab, it'll have this material on it as we've adjusted. To make a new material then, I'll right-click here in my Environment Materials and choose Create and Material. I'm going to make a different material for one of my blocks, those green building bricks in here. I'll call this one Blocks Orange. Now that I've got this new material created, I'll unlock my inspector. And there's the new material, ready for adjusting. I'll leave it as a standard, and I'm going to put in a color. If we don't have a map coming in, we can simply put in a main color of this material. Again, clicking on that color swatch and selecting the color. I'll put in a good vibrant orange, roughly a hue of 35, and a saturation almost all the way up, a nice bright value, and a full alpha. If you'd like, when you're making colors, you can add this as a preset, clicking on that color and adding it into your presets at the bottom. Now that I've got the color in, I'll adjust the smoothness. I'm going to make this one a little bit shinier, but first I'll take a look at one of the other materials. It looks in here like the smoothness of our red is about 0.42. I'd like these to read as a little bit more plastic, so I'll make sure metallic is at 0 and bring up smoothness right around 0.6. I'll do the same in the other material, as I'm assuming these are all made of the same material with just different colors. We can definitely see a difference in the shading here between standard and standard specular setup. Again, whichever one you choose, make sure that you're consistent in your creation, so that like objects, like our blocks here, share the same shading but have different colors. I'm going to switch my blocks then over to a standard. Now my blocks materials are ready, and I can pull them onto objects as I need. I'll take one more look at a more complex material here, again looking at some of my characters. Here's our Zombunny, and when we take a look at this material, opening up that Zombunny object and clicking on the Zombunny itself, we can see there's different things going on. There's two materials on it, both standard specular setup, one for the eyes and one for the actual Zombunny itself. In the eyes here, there's an albedo, which is white, and it's got a specular color of a medium gray. It's fairly smooth and fairly shiny. It does have an emission color. What we see in here is that it's got a deep gray in the emission. This will make those eyes slightly glow, as if they're emitting a little bit of light. We can also see that the global illumination from this emissive material is set to real time, that as this Zombunny moves around, in real time it will affect the lighting of what it's near. The other material in our Zombunny then is the Zombunny material. Again, standard with specular setup. What we can see in here is that there's an albedo, a specular, a normal, occlusion, and emission. When we look at the albedo, what we can actually see here is that it's fairly bright on those blue stripes. There's no alpha channel with it. The emission then is a bit different. In the emission map for this material, we've got the blue stripes maintaining their color from the albedo. However, the rest of the map is blacked out. The only place we want this Zombunny to emit light is from those blue stripes in this color. Here's our Zombunny material again, and we can really see how all those pieces come together in that material. Again, simply by creating a material and dragging our imagery in.